Welcome to Back Pocket Universe. I'm Elliot. I like to pick random vintage science fiction paperback books off of the shelves of local bookstores and thrift stores and read them and tell you what they make me think about in these videos. Today I'm going to be talking about Changeling Earth by Fred Saberhagen. This is copyright 1973. What I didn't know at the time that I picked it up is that it actually is part of a series. This is the third book in a series by Saberhagen, and ultimately there would be four books, but the first three books would be compiled into a trilogy a few years later, with this as the final part in the trilogy. There's no indication at all in the front matter or otherwise that this is part of a series. So I didn't know that when I started reading it. The story takes place 50,000 years in the future, when high technology, is a distant memory and technology doesn't really function, but there's magic. And most of the world is ruled by an evil empire, the Empire of the East, and its one dimensionally evil emperor, John Amanor. Holding out against him is a small army of ragtag barbarians from the west. So it's east versus west. The main character, Rolf, is one of these barbarians. He's being guided by a subtle and mysterious power called Ardna, who, with Rolf's help, is trying to grow powerful enough to stage a final battle between itself and the demonic powers of the East. So that's the story. I was drawn to this, well, first of all, because of the cool cover art. I could tell from the cover that this was going to be kind of in the fantasy genre. And you can see that it's got this kind of cool wizard who looks like maybe something out of Masters of the Universe. Um, and he's on top of what looks like maybe a computer bank or some kind of machine. And behind him is this demonic uh, entity of some kind. And if you look really close, you can see that the wizard is actually about to perform a human sacrifice. So kind of pulpy, kind of reminds me of a cartoon from the 1980s. Just kind of a cool dramatic cover by Tim Kirk. And the other part that caught my eye is that it takes place 50,000 years in the future. If you've watched these videos, you know that I'm a sucker for deep time. And so I picked up the book despite the fact that I could tell that it was definitely going to be set in more of a fantasy setting than a sci-fi setting. And I don't really read a lot of fantasy these days. So I did like some things about this book. One of the major draws for me with a deep time story is when a story that is set in the distant past or distant future has elements that find their way in that are somehow familiar to our time. So, kind of like a point of connection between a time that is distant from our own and either our own time or something that feels familiar to our own time. Um, I think this probably comes from my lifelong fascination with out of place artifacts, things that people dig up from other times that just don't seem to fit the time period from which they come. This book does deliver in that regard. It has, for example, a medieval style barbarian wandering through the halls of a computer filled bunker, which that sort of contrast of imagery just always tickles me pink. Beyond that, the book was competently written, it was easy to follow. And even though it turned out to be the third book in a series, the context was well enough explained that nothing about it was very confusing. I didn't feel like I was missing anything. And that was both good and bad. So I'll talk about what I didn't like. Typically, if I see a book that's set later in a series, I'll either pass on it or I'll go and find the first book in the series if I'm interested in it before picking up the later one. In this case, I didn't have any idea that it was part of a series until I did a little background research while reading it. And by the way, I spoiled kind of like the major surprise in the book, which I'll also spoil for you in the course of this video. So just a heads up on that. Um, Furthermore, if I had not done the research and not found out that it was part of a series, I'm not sure it would have ever occurred to me that it was. The story was cohesive enough and the exposition was comprehensive enough that I never felt like I was missing anything important while reading it. And if I'm honest, even though I now know that this is the third book in a series, I still don't feel like I'm missing anything by not having read the first two books. I would read another book by Fred Saberhagen if I found one, but nothing in me feels compelled to go back and read the first two books in this series and fill in whatever pieces may be missing from the overall story. There just wasn't enough to keep me interested. The story wasn't compelling enough, the characters weren't fleshed out enough to make me want to do anything more than just finish the book itself. I think that the main reason for this, despite the fact that, or yeah, one thing was that the characters were bland and one-dimensional. No character ever really developed enough of a personality to really feel like I was getting connected to them. Um, and the other part that I didn't really like about this book is that the premise just didn't really seem to hold water, despite the fact that by the end of the book, it was fairly well explained. So I didn't feel like I was missing anything from the premise. I just felt like it didn't quite make sense in and of itself. A really important thing about any fantasy or science fiction is not so much that the core concept makes a lot of sense or is scientifically verifiable, but it has to establish rules and then stick to those rules. And those rules have to be basically cohesive and coherent enough and established early enough that as you're following the story, you're not always mentally checking yourself against the rules or trying to figure out what the rules are, if that makes sense. So, what's the big idea of this story? Well, some of my favorite fiction is fantasy, specifically in the sword and sorcery genre. So I don't have anything against magic per se. I'm thinking of Clark Ashton Smith's Zothique stories and William Hope Hodgson's The Nightland, which is one of my favorite all-time books. And those both take place in the distant future, and they both contain magic or supernatural elements. Robert E. Howard's Conan stories take place in the distant past, obviously have a lot of supernatural and magical elements, but also hints of races and times earlier than the stories in which some kind of technology exists. Um, so in all these cases, the transition between technology and magic, uh, or the overlap between the two, is sort of shrouded in mystery, and the worlds themselves are depicted with a really well fleshed out, mystifying quality that just feels like you know where you are and what's happening. And when a technology from another time is introduced into the story, it's both intriguing and it doesn't feel jarring or out of sync with the story that you're in. Um, Changeling Earth has what seems to be an interesting premise. The idea is that modern civilization collapsed 50,000 years ago. And in that collapse, which is called the change, technology is essentially replaced with magic. The idea is that there is a force unleashed by scientists, and Ardna is central to this force, or is the force itself, called the change. And what the change does is it it transforms atomic power or changes the laws of physics in such a way that atomic power no longer works. And this change happens right in the nick of time, as far as I can tell, just as nuclear bombs are starting to explode. So when the change takes place, all that atomic power, the atomic explosions are transformed instead into demonic entities. And a world that moments ago was ruled by high technology is now ruled by magic. And there's something, for lack of a better word, magical about this whole premise that to me just doesn't hold up as anything like a coherent concept. I Even though it's explained in the course of the book, it still doesn't make sense to me exactly how that change takes place. And it doesn't seem very consistent throughout the book exactly what that change means and what effects it has on the laws of physics on Earth. The decisions made around the effects of the change 50,000 years later seem to be somewhat arbitrary. So, for example, Ardna, who, as it turns out, is a giant computer, communicates with Rolf psychically and interacts with the world using what appears to be magic. In other words, the the technological representation in this technology versus science world also appears to be using magical methods to accomplish its goals. And so the whole thing just feels arbitrary. And the fact that I couldn't kind of get an internal map of what the rules of this particular universe were just made the whole story feel just kind of boring and uncompelling to me. And in a similar way, the overall plot and the characters, they feel kind of utilitarian. There just isn't enough intrigue or depth or nuance or spice to them to really make them all that interesting. So they push the plot along to a reasonably satisfying conclusion, but they never really established any really believable internal momentum, in my opinion. So, you could do worse than reading The Changeling Earth by Fred Saberhagen if you ever come across it. But this isn't a book that I would highly recommend by any means, mainly because there is not a core philosophical or social or technological premise behind it that really, to me, feels very thought provoking. But there were some things that I was thinking about while I was reading the book that definitely seemed to have a connection to the story itself, however loose. The, the notion of the book, in which there is this this fundamental change to the laws of physics is an interesting one to me because it poses a world in which seemingly in the blink of the eye, because of this fundamental shift in the laws of physics that's taken place, the world is one way 1 second and then another way another second. And for the people living on Earth at the time, it would have been presumably impossible to predict what the world would look like and what their lives would look like before and after the change that takes place. And in the past couple of weeks, I've been thinking a lot about the idea of the technological singularity. We're living in an interesting moment right now where for the past few months, since roughly the beginning of 2023, artificial intelligence has been emerging into the public's consciousness in a new way and has been increasing its role in our lives very quickly. And there are very frequent, very impressive demonstrations of new AI technology on a weekly or sometimes daily basis. And so, this idea of a technological singularity in which, well, let me define it. A singularity in this case is essentially it's a point in time beyond which we cannot predict. So the idea is that something happens that is so fundamental a shift that we have no way of seeing what happens on the other side of it. And in this case, the fundamental shift is the emergence of an artificial intelligence that is more intelligent than humans. So, of course, as humans, we can only imagine what we can imagine. And our capacity for imagining the future is based on the level of intelligence and knowledge that we have as a species. So we can't predict anything beyond or outside of that or different than that. So if you have an intelligence that is greater than that of humans and also in some way or another is alien to that of humans, then by definition, we simply can't predict or imagine what's going to happen when it has an influence on the world in which we live. And that's the singularity. And so Changeling Earth poses something along the lines of a singularity, although not exactly the kind that we're thinking about. In this case, it changes the laws of physics so that in one way or another, things physically don't behave the way in which they used to. And as a result of that, it creates a world that is fundamentally different than you imagined than it might have been. And so when you think of the world 50,000 years in the future, you wouldn't think that there are, wizards and dragons and things like that. But surprise, there are. And um, it occurs to me that we we seem to be living in a time right now that possibly is in that realm where we really have no way of accurately predicting what the world is going to look like in a fairly short period of time. And we don't know exactly how all this is going to shake out. And it's possible that despite all the hype around the technologies that are emerging now, that we will settle into a sort of, relatively intuitive symbiotic relationship with it. And sort of the way things have been going so far is that things get a little bit faster and a little bit crazier, but ultimately we keep going in a relatively predictable trajectory. But even as I'm saying that, I mean, when most of the books that I read were written in the mid century, the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, there was just no notion that personal computers and the internet would fundamentally shift the attention and focus of our species. For most of that time period, there were two sort of conflicting ideas. One idea is that we would use a great technology at our disposal, namely atomic technology, to destroy ourselves. And that would be it. Humanity would either be wiped out or reduced to a very primitive state. The other concept was that uh, computerization, production, automation technologies would carry us into a better future, a future aided by technology in which we would have more leisure time, in which we would explore the solar system and beyond, in which we would solve the basic problems of supply and demand that faced humanity. And it turns out that technology did not predict or did not progress in that way, in a very real way, because of personal computers and the internet. Our technology turned inward. And so the world is moving a lot faster than it used to. Everybody knows a lot more, or has access, I should say, to more information than they used to. But neither of those basic predictions, on one hand, the prediction that we would destroy ourselves, or on the other hand, the prediction that we would use technology to bring ourselves into a utopia of leisure and exploration. Neither of those has happened. And instead, we're living in a world that has a completely different set of challenges, and one that seems to have been almost impossible for people in the mid-century, the mid 20th century, to predict. In other words, in at least a minor way, the emergence of technologies like personal computing and the internet were a singularity as far as authors from this time were concerned. And one of the things that always strikes me most about these stories, pretty much every single book, when you're seeing characters interacting with computers, whether it's in the distant future or whatever, they're using tapes. They're using magnetic tapes to interface with the computers, because for the authors of this time, it simply did not occur to them that there was any other method of storing information. And it's something that immediately snaps you out of the immersion of the stories, as we realize that technology has progressed for us in a very mundane way, very far beyond that point. So this book did get me thinking about that, or at least corresponded to my thoughts about that this week. This notion of the question of, are we on the verge of another singularity? Are we living in a point of history where we have a perspective that is fundamentally limited in some way? And is there a point of time, 10 years, 5 years, 1 year from now, where things will shift in such a fundamental way that any predictions we make about the future are irrelevant? I find that idea a little bit terrifying, but mostly exciting, because while we can imagine a lot of good things about the future, we can also imagine a lot of bad things. And there's a certain excitement about just not knowing what happens next. But you do know what book I'm going to review next, and that is Envoy to New Worlds by Keith Lammer. I'm reading this right now. And this is actually a double. And on the other side is Flight from Yesterday by Robert Moore Williams. I'm going to try to read both this week and review both if I can. But if I can't do that, I'll just review Envoy to New Worlds next week. So until then, thank you for watching this video and listening to my ramblings, and I'll be seeing you.